have spent a great deal of time reporting on modern-day slavery, specifically modern-day slavery in supply chains of companies that sell in American markets. Before I introduce the speakers, I just want to make clear at the outset what it is that I'm talking about when I refer to modern-day slavery. First of all, my name is Ben Skinner. I'm a senior fellow at the Schuster Institute for Investigative Journalism at Brandeis. I've been focused on modern-day slavery for the better part of 10 years now. I wrote a book called A Crime So Monstrous, Face to Face with Modern-Day Slavery, and my definition, my working definition of slavery is the process by which people are made to work under threat of violence for no pay beyond subsistence. Slaves today are no metaphor. These are people that cannot walk away from their work. By that mere definition, although we don't know exact numbers, there are more slaves today than at any point in human history. The latest ILO estimate, which came out about a month ago, this is the International Labor Organization, their estimate was 20.9 million slaves in the world today. Today we have, or I have a particular honor of introducing two journalists who really moved our latest initiative at the Schuster Institute to investigate slavery in the supply chains of major corporations. Michael Smith and David Voreacos have in 2005, correct? Was that when you conducted the investigation? 2006, okay. 2006, they published an investigation in Bloomberg Markets that was a seminal work, 6-month investigation detailing slavery in the supply chains of major American utilities and car manufacturers. I won't go into too much detail, I'll let them talk about it. Before I introduce them, before I let them talk about it, I want to briefly introduce them. David is a reporter for Bloomberg News, and together with Michael Smith, they've worked on this story for Bloomberg Markets. Michael is at Bloomberg Markets and joins us today from Santiago, Chile. With that said, I want to turn it over very quickly to them and allow them to talk about their investigation and some of the challenges. And what I'd ask you guys to do is basically just tell the story of the story. And then we'll get into some conversation a little bit afterwards. And I will also talk about an investigation that I conducted at the Schuster Institute after they're done with a terrific colleague who's in attendance here. To Michael and David.
Good morning. Thank you for coming at such an early hour to talk about this with us. This story, I guess we got into it because prior to working for Bloomberg Markets, I worked for Bloomberg News, which is our news service, global news service covering Brazil. I was living in Rio de Janeiro. I lived there for almost 4 years, covering all kinds of news from Brazil, and I started seeing spot news reports in Brazil about a government task force freeing slaves in these raids in the Amazon mainland and other parts of Brazil. And I just became astounded that there was anything resembling slavery still in the world today. Brazil was the last country in the world to abolish slavery in the late 1800s, about 20 or 30 years after it was abolished in the United States, and I couldn't believe that there was anything like slavery that still existed. And I started looking into it, and I found reports from the ILO that then mentioned the amount of numbers periodically, and I just started thinking, what are these people being used to make? everything in life almost, I think, comes down to money. And the only reason you would want to use slaves is to produce something that you're selling to someone else. And so that's how I got onto the story, and I convinced my editor that it was a good story, and I started looking into it on a sort of big picture look, and then I started figuring out that the things that they were making were going into critical commodities that go into just about anything you use in your day-to-day life, which is mainly steel, precious metals, timber, and other things that are very basic to the consumer society that we all enjoy today. You know, like gold, for example. Gold in your wedding ring, gold in your watch, these metals that are in your iPhone, the stuff your car is made out of, appliances. And I just started thinking, you know, that this is where all this comes from, so this is a really important story. So that's how we got into the story. And basically in our story, what we do is we trace, the foundation of the story is actually going out and witnessing in the middle of nowhere where these people are sort of being forced to work in places that are really, really about as far away from our reality here as you can imagine. And once we were able to witness and document that reality, the rest of it just sort of fell into place. Once you find, you know, where it's happening, it's really quite easy to figure out, okay, where are you sending the gold that you're digging out of the jungle in Peru, or who's buying the charcoal that you're making, you know, where are you sending this log that you just pulled out of the jungle? And once you get that first link, you just have to keep following up the chain until you get to, you know, Ford Motor Company. I mean, it sounds very simplistic the way I'm putting it, but that's really all it is. And it's not as hard as you might think to do. Once you document and prove beyond a reasonable doubt that slavery is occurring in this particular situation. And it really, and I've done a number of stories since then, not necessarily about slavery in the purest definition, but about how multinationals are taking advantage of globalization, of the dismantling of trade barriers, legal and commercial barriers to cross-border trade, to basically find a way to use the most extreme exploitation of labor and environmental and other sort of humane conditions to get the lowest price for whatever they need to make whatever they're selling. And it happens over and over again. I mean, you know, every story I've done for the last 6 years, it's about that. It's not always slavery, but it's just as horrific when you get down to seeing the way life really is for so many people. And you find in the United States, I mean, you don't have to go to the Amazon to do it. You can go to the restaurant down the block, or you can go to a farm really close to where you live, and you can probably find things like this going on. And once you do, you can pretty much bet that whatever these folks are doing is going to something that you use every day. You just take the patience to follow the chain, and that's what we try to do.
David, do you want to talk a little bit about the case?
Yeah. Mike really did a remarkable job of witnessing some terrible labor conditions. He's very modest about his reporting and his writing, but that's what made the story so strong, is what Mike actually saw. And then we were able, through shipping records and talking to brokers, to figure out where the pig iron in particular, which was produced in Brazil, where it went in the United States. And so there were probably 3 or 4 steps after the charcoal that was produced by slave labor then became pig iron, went into the production of pig iron in Brazil, and then we were able to, again, using shipping records and talking to brokers and following the websites of producers, figure out what companies were using that pig iron in the production of steel. And Mike and I have talked about this many times, but and I've said this a lot, there's a number of tributaries that go into a commodity stream. And if there's a tainted tributary, then we're trying to see, does that taint the larger stream and river? And ultimately what we concluded was we were quite certain that slave labor was used in the production of these commodities, and so then we were quite comfortable that that ultimately ended up in the final products of big corporations like General Motors, Toyota, Whirlpool, and they were not able to really dispute what we reported. And another point that Mike and I realized is if we could present credible evidence to a corporation that the commodities in their products were tainted by slave labor, they don't really have a strong response except, we're shocked and we don't abide by this and we're not going to allow it to happen. So the challenge is to show that in fact these commodities were tainted by slave labor. And one of the things that Mike was able to do was that he was able to go out with government inspectors in Brazil and also find a judge in Peru who could document the conditions. And in Brazil, they have a task force, a mobile task force, right, that affirmatively declares that these conditions are slave labor. And there was a judge in Peru who was doing the same thing in the gold mining camps. So that gave us an authority in doing the reporting that the companies couldn't assail it and say, well, this is just the product of an NGO with an axe to grind, or some activists, because it's the government itself speaking. And so, we were quite comfortable that these labor conditions had been characterized as slavery by the governments, the national governments, and so that gave us confidence going forward.
Okay. I'm going to try using this live mic, otherwise you might thanks both very much. As I say, Michael and David's work was really an inspiration and a model for our work as well at the Schuster Institute, our first pilot project on investigating slavery in the supply chains of a major national industry. That industry, the industry that we chose was the New Zealand fishing industry, which is an industry that immediately one might not think of as having slave labor. This was a case where, very much unlike the Brazilian situation, the government had not produced anything like a robust response. And the information came to us about slavery and supply chains from a Western diplomatic source that said, this is a real problem, this is a real issue. This is slavery according to your definition. And it's happening in the deep waters in what New Zealand refers to as its exclusive economic zone, between 12 and 200 miles off the coast of New Zealand. So the way that I chose to tell the story, and very much like David and Michael, I had a very strong partner who was doing the tracing stateside, Sophie Elsner, who's here with us. raise your hand, Sophie, at least, who really did a phenomenal job of tracing a very difficult and opaque supply chain. I'll get to that in a moment, but for now, suffice to say that if you want to find out where your fish comes from, you can't, because most places won't tell you. At least they won't tell you the intermediaries. So we began to. I began with the premise that I wanted to tell the story of as many of the survivors as would speak to me, and to go out and find them involved a process of going into the docks at night in New Zealand when the deep sea fishing vessels would come in, using intermediaries that spoke Indonesian. The victims in these cases were Indonesian, and the crews, or rather the officers and the ships, were Korean flagged. And there's a system in place in New Zealand called the Foreign Charter Vessel System, which has essentially allowed the exploitation of these workers because they're in this murky legal territory. Very much unlike the Brazilian model, where you have mobile task forces going out and rigorously enforcing labor laws. Some of the whistleblowers that we were able to take advantage of were individuals who were New Zealand Ministry of Fisheries observers, who had either spoken to us or spoken to academics who had at the University of Auckland Business School, who had done some research on this earlier, and who had seen gross labor violations, beatings. I had one individual tell me about an observed sexual abuse situation, and then I had a number of individuals talk about the endemic sexual abuse on these boats. So what we found was literally hundreds of individuals that were in situations of suspected slavery. I interviewed 39 victims and survivors, and for the story, I chose one particular survivor to sort of bring his story to the masses. And one of my operating principles as a writer is I also have to qualify it whenever you're going to quote Joseph Stalin. So sometimes the worst people have the best quotes. But Stalin was supposed to have said the death of a million men is a statistic, the death of one man is a tragedy. And I wanted to show exactly what, in this case, Useful, I've changed his name, what the tragedy of his victimization, but also the hope of his story. So Useful was a young man from central Java who, in a rather desperate situation, his wife was 8 months pregnant. He'd actually put his name on a waiting list for a job in the New Zealand fishing industry some 9 months earlier. Signed a contract that he was not allowed to read. He was rushed through it. The terms of this particular contract were explained to him afterwards. He was also asked to sign other contracts in languages that he didn't read, that he didn't know how to read, including English. And this particular contract states there are several stipulations that essentially bound him to his work. Among other things, he would forfeit the equivalent of $3,500, which was roughly the sum total of his assets, of his net worth, if he walked away for any unauthorized reason from the ship. And he had to submit a title to his land, to his family land, in order to shore this up. fee, took a loan for the on a fishing vessel, the Malayla 203, seen here in dry dock. These photos, by the way, or the first photos were taken by Sanjit Das. This is Jocelyn Carlin. Both of them did terrific work for this. The Malayla 203 is here in dry dock because shortly after shortly before publication of the piece, the ship was arrested thanks to the labor charges. He was on board this ship. He was regularly verbally abused, occasionally physically abused. The intimidation against him and his colleagues was constant. They were not allowed to refuse overtime work. They were working in extraordinarily dangerous conditions. When one of his colleagues, who I interviewed, broke his hand in 4 places, he was denied access to medical care for over a month. He's now has no use of his hand. Eventually, and there is now a court case in a New Zealand district court, finally, on this. But all this time, Eustrel and the other workers felt, well, this was just essentially what we have to put up with. This is, you know, we thought we'd get a better deal in New Zealand, but clearly we can't walk away. We'll be punished. There were threats constantly of deportation to Indonesia, where the recruiters would take their due against the workers or their families. And so they didn't speak out until a labor ministry official from the New Zealand Labor Ministry, acting very much on his own, independently, went in one night and showed Eustrel a list of basic rights. And these rights included a minimum wage, included the right to walk away from their work if they objected to it, the right to be free of sexual abuse, which was endemic on that boat. The officers would regularly sexually abuse the crew members. And the way Eustrel described it was like an epiphany. And he began to talk to the others on the boat, and they said, hey, listen, I think the New Zealand government is going to protect us in this. So they went to the officers, and they said, you know, we demand our rights. And the officers said, well, you have that piece of paper, and we have, you know, all the power over you. We're going back out to sea, whether you like it or not, and you're going to, you know, nothing's going to change. And before they could leave dock, the crew members walked off. They took shelter in a local parish church, and that basically broke the story wide open. This happened while I was in country reporting on this. And they expected the New Zealand government to stand up for them. Long story short, the New Zealand government was less than robust in their protections. They submitted to the requests of the fishing company to deport the individuals. They went back to Indonesia. When they got back home, the recruiters found them, asked them to sign documents that said that we relinquish our demands for human rights. There were 2 pro bono lawyers that had picked up the case in New Zealand, and this document said we won't work with them. They would be paid a certain amount of money, in theory their dues for working, but only if they signed that document. And the alternative was to be hounded by their recruiters and to be harassed and have their families harassed at home. So all but, of the original 24 that walked off, all but 2 signed it, and one of the 2 was Eustrel. And when I spoke to him less than a month before the story's publication, when I spoke to him over Skype and I asked him why he didn't sign the document, he pointed to his heart and he said, dignity. And that, for me, was summed up, I think, so much of his courage. The other side of this that Sophie was so instrumental in working on was the tracing of the fish. And what we found was it wound up in a number of American markets, in a number of American retailers, wholesalers, and restaurants. And it was and I think, perhaps as you guys found, the most compelling moments for us and the most, for me, the most revelatory aspect of this. I've been reporting on slavery for 10 years, and rarely have I seen change happen very quickly, the impact of the piece happen very quickly. This was a case where it did happen very quickly. 10 days after the publication of the story, the Ministry of Fisheries and the Ministry of Labor released a 163-page report, which had been in the planning for some time, but was very effectively, we believe, changed, and they cited the Bloomberg piece, the Business Week piece in the story, or in the report. And the recommendations essentially were to do away with the foreign charter vessel system. About 3 weeks ago, the New Zealand government announced that they were doing away with the foreign charter vessel system, which is a system that had been in place for decades, a system that local activists and local journalists, by the way, had been reporting on for years, the slavery that was endemic to this system. The big difference is when you name Walmart, Safeway, Whole Foods, P.F. Chang's, a whole range of companies in a piece, and you're talking about a very small nation's industry, and an industry that's very important to that small nation. Reputational damage can move things very, very quickly. Essentially, that's the story. Unfortunately, it's not the end of the story for Usrol, who's blacklisted, who's still struggling. This is him with his 1-year-old son. It is one that I think is rewarding enough for me as a journalist, so that I'm dedicated to this type of work, and I'm eager to talk to all of you about your ideas and questions about how to perform it. Let's see, how are we doing on time? So we have about half an hour left. I'm going to ask just a couple of questions and then open it to the floor. So please prepare some thoughts. But I wanted to ask you guys first. In terms of sources, David, you talked a bit about the databases. I'm wondering about human sources that you might have used with the companies, and Michael, sources that you would have used on the ground, and concerns for protection, precautions. What was your methodology there, and how did? First of all, what were the sources, and what was the methodology of protecting them?
We talked to a number of brokers of pig iron to try to understand how the industry works and the flow of commodities from Brazil to the United States. And we also did it, I visited some timber brokers in the South, and went to see Nucor Steel in South Carolina. And we said that we were trying to understand how this industry works. Could you explain to us from the movement of these barges, through New Orleans, where does it go from there? And then there are websites, for the smaller companies companies along the way that say this is where we sell our products. So, we were able to establish pretty credibly where the pig iron moved, and once we were quite comfortable in our reporting, then we went to the companies and said, this is what we found, do you have a response? And the bigger companies have these social responsibility policies, and what we were able to find was a pretty egregious violation of those policies.